The history of British Columbia is one not unlike the rest of Western North America. It is one of gold rush and boom towns, one of industry and settlers who sought a better life in one of the last true frontiers, a land of opportunity for those brave enough to seek it out. And while the West Kootenays might share this history, all the same, this southern region of British Columbia has another tale to tell.
Летите, голуби, летите, для вас нигде преграды нет. Несите, голуби, несите, народам мира наш привет. Несите, голуби, несите, народам мира наш привет.
Just west of Grand Forks, in the hills opposite Highway 3, there lies the village of Ozerov. This once thriving Doukhobor community now lies abandoned, but for the private residents in one of its outbuildings. Ozerov is one of many century-old Doukhobor communes scattered throughout the whole of this valley in the entirety of western Grand Forks. The story for as to how these villages were built and why they now lay abandoned is a story that begins more than 2 centuries earlier in Imperial Russia. In 1653, reforms made by the Russian Patriarch Nikon of Moscow resulted in a major division within the Russian Orthodox Church. While many churches endorsed Nikon's reforms, a group known as the Raskolniki, or Old Believers, openly rejected Nikon's reforms in favor of their traditional religious beliefs. Within the Raskolniki was a subgroup known as the Bezpopovtsi, who, as opposed to other Raskolniki, rejected the requirement for priests to lead a service, as they believed every human being to be a quote-unquote living church. It were these beliefs that eventually resulted in the creation of the Doukhobors, an ethno-religious group that first took shape in 17th and 18th century Imperial Russia. The first known usage of the term Doukhobor was around 1785, when the Russian Orthodox Archbishop Ambrosius of Ekaterinoslav referred to them as Doukhoborets, or spirit wrestlers, suggesting that as enemies of the Russian Orthodox Church, they were wrestling with the Spirit of God. By the turn of the 18th century, however, the group adopted the name Doukhobors, instead meaning that they were wrestling alongside the Spirit of God, not against. And this name has remained with them ever since. The Doukhobors were largely agricultural Christian people who, under their first known leader, Sylvan Kolesnikov, believed in the rejection of religious icons, pacifism, material simplicity, and eventually a system of communal ownership. It was Kolesnikov who first introduced the most prominent symbol of the Doukhobor faith: a loaf of bread, a vessel of salt, and a jug of water, an embodiment of the Doukhobor anti-materialist and simplistic way of life. Their anti-military, pacifist beliefs would, however, result in unavoidable conflict between the Doukhobors and their country, the Russian Empire, a highly militaristic government of which represented everything the Doukhobors opposed. deportation to Finland, resettlement in the Milky Waters region on the Crimean Peninsula, and banishment to the mountains of Transcaucasia were common repercussions for the early Doukhobors, who openly protested military conscription, state and church laws, and forced assimilation under the Tsarist rule of Imperial Russia. The oppression of the Doukhobors under the Imperial Russian state would continue for most of the 19th century until in 1885, leadership of the Doukhobors passed to Peter Vasilyevich Verygin, a young Doukhobor from the village of Slavonka who took up the position following the death of Lukiria Kalmakova, Sylvan Kolesnikov's daughter-in-law. Under Verygin's leadership, the Doukhobors would experience something of a spiritual revival. Verygin encouraged the abstaining of alcohol, tobacco, and meat, many Doukhobors henceforth becoming vegetarians. But in 1887, Verygin was exiled to Siberia for allegedly instigating the Doukhobors, and would remain there for the next 16 years. Regardless of his exile, however, Verygin would continue to lead the Doukhobors from Siberia, communicating with his people through a series of secret letters. Pacifism was once again prioritized, and when Tsar Nicholas II introduced compulsory military service and an oath of allegiance, the Doukhobors took a stand. And on June 28, 1895, 7,000 Doukhobors across 3 districts of the Caucasus burned their weapons in protest of the Tsar. As a result of their insubordination, the Doukhobors faced beatings, floggings, and exile. And following the gun burning of 1895, the Russian government actively pursued a policy of cultural cleansing concerning the Doukhobors. While in exile, Peter Verygin became inspired by the works of Leo Tolstoy, famed Russian author of the likes of War and Peace and Anna Karenina, who, like the Doukhobors, opposed capitalism and presented ideas like communal ownership. Horrified by the treatment of the Doukhobors, Verygin sent letters and successfully communicated with Tolstoy, informing him of the situation. Tolstoy admired and pitied the Doukhobors, and after sending one of his followers, Pavel Biryakov, to investigate the persecution of the Doukhobors, Biryakov published an article in the London Times titled "The Persecution of Christians in Russia." This headline undoubtedly drew global attention to the treatment of the Doukhobors in Russia, and facing public backlash and mounting pressure from the international community, Dowager Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna and the Tsarist government gave permission for the Doukhobors to leave, never to return. Following the exodus from Russia, some Doukhobors found temporary refuge on the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean Sea. But the climate proved too hot for the northerly Doukhobors, and many did not survive. The Doukhobors considered many countries for resettlement, but following the advice of Russian exile and Doukhobor sympathizer Peter Kropotkin, the Doukhobors set their sights on Canada, a relatively untapped territory in a more familiar northerly area of the world, a land of opportunity for those brave enough to seek it out. From the port of Batumi in modern-day Georgia, the Doukhobors embarked on their transatlantic journey in 1898, arriving in Canada by 1899. The migration and settlement was largely financed by Leo Tolstoy himself, who dedicated the proceeds from his book Resurrection to the cause, raising $17,000 for the resettlement of the Doukhobors in Canada. 7,500 Doukhobors arrived in Canada, settling on 3 large blocks of land on the prairies of modern-day Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, establishing 61 villages in the next few years. When the Doukhobors first migrated to Canada, they were assured that their community could hold their lands in common as their communal beliefs permitted. But by 1901, the Canadian government had changed its policies. The Doukhobors were now required to register homesteads individually, and the government began to enforce its power more readily than the community had hoped. Disillusioned and leaderless, the Doukhobors were undoubtedly concerned, but luckily in 1902, Peter Verrigan arrived in Canada after 16 years in exile, where he once again took up leadership of the Doukhobors. Not unlike Tsarist Russia, the Canadian government enforced an ultimatum upon the Doukhobors. They must register their lands individually, accept Canadian citizenship, and swear an oath of allegiance or risk the confiscation of their land. While only 230 Doukhobors accepted the government's terms, the rest of the community unsurprisingly refused, resulting in the confiscation of around 2/3 of their property and a total loss of around $11 million for the Doukhobors. In 1908, the Doukhobors commenced the largest internal migration in Canadian history. Borrowing money from the banks and raising funds from the sale of their old lives, the Doukhobor community purchased large plots of largely unsettled land in the Kootenay region of British Columbia, near the town sites of modern-day Grand Forks, Castlegar, and Nelson. In this new world, the Doukhobors would rebuild, and were free from hardship for a time.
Как же мне признаться, если я люблю, полюбил я, братцы, девушку в степном краю.
The Kootenay region was, and still is, a very much forested landscape. And so when the Doukhobors first arrived here in Grand Forks, they occupied themselves with logging. And once the trees were cleared, the community returned to an economy of agriculture and orchards. The Doukhobors built a great many villages, or communal dwellings, consisting of 2 large living quarters connected by many outbuildings that formed a central courtyard, and contained bathhouses, workshops, and kitchens. While very few, if not any villages of this original design still exist in the world, many singular domes, meaning houses, still dot the hillsides of western Grand Forks, where the largest quantity of Doukhobor architecture in the West Kootenays is contained. While many of these villages are in a state beyond repair, and many are private residences, there are some that remain mostly open to the public, like the McCordoff village near Hardy Mountain, or as is more aptly known, the Hardy Mountain Doukhobor village, which since its acquirement by the regional district of the Kootenay boundary in 2015 is apparently en route to once again becoming a tourist attraction. Just uphill from the village of McCordoff, in the valley of Saddle Mountain, lies the more natural attraction that is Saddle Lake, which upon closer inspection isn't natural at all. The reservoir of Saddle Lake was created in 1915, when the Doukhobors dammed the wetland for the irrigation of the massive amount of farmland and orchards that once blanketed this valley. The valley that the Doukhobors once called Dolina Fructova, meaning the Valley of Fruit. On the other side of Saddle Mountain lies the site of the now demolished village of Gritchen and the old Fructova schoolhouse built in 1929. Just below the schoolhouse is the site of what used to be the Doukhobor brick factory, where all the bricks for the Doukhobor builds were produced. And even further south lies the well-preserved Doukhobor boiler house and workers' cafeteria, which served the now non-existent jam factory. The Fructova schoolhouse has since been taken over by the Boundary Museum and Interpretive Center, of which contains one of the greatest collections of Doukhobor heritage in BC. The Fructova schoolhouse was built in 1929 as a school for local Doukhobor children, where they would be educated as required by BC law. But the school was decommissioned in the late 1940s, when students were instead bused to the Central Elementary School near downtown Grand Forks, and the building fell into disrepair, until the building was renovated in the late 1980s when there was a resurgence in the preservation of Doukhobor buildings in BC. Another example of a well-preserved Doukhobor site is the Pride of the Valley Flour Mill, where the Doukhobors once produced flour for the entire region, or the USCC Hall, where Doukhobor descendants still hold gatherings and practice their Christian faith. Doukhobor history remains a significant part of the culture in Grand Forks, and is probably the most prominent. But a shadow looms over this history, a shadow that it seems wasn't talked about for a very long time. Just east of Grand Forks, on the south side of the Kettle River, there lies the village of Gilpin. An unincorporated community, Gilpin is now mostly home to the descendants of an infamous Doukhobor subgroup, the Sons of Freedom, or as they're more commonly known, the Freedomites, a subsect of the Doukhobors that first emerged in Saskatchewan and believed in most of the things all Doukhobors believed in: the rejection of religious icons, material simplicity, and communal ownership, albeit in a much more aggressive and fanatic way. But while the majority of the Doukhobor community chose to cooperate with the Canadian government, negotiating and building BC-regulated schools like at Fructova, the Sons of Freedom instead opted to protest not only the Canadian government, but the entirety of the Doukhobor community as a whole, who they viewed as being increasingly materialistic with their more lucrative enterprises, and abandoning their traditional, anti-materialist beliefs. The Sons of Freedom took to acts of protest that mostly included public nudity and naked marches. But this eventually also included the burning of their own possessions, symbolic of their renunciation of material things. Freedomite protests throughout the 20th century would however soon escalate to acts of extreme terrorism, with the burnings and bombings of railway bridges, power lines, and public schools, all in protest of the Canadian government and what they believed were the evils of materialism. Freedomite terrorism also included the destruction of Doukhobor property and community buildings in protest of their more materialist tendencies, which greatly impacted the stability of the Doukhobor community in Canada, especially considering that this wave of Freedomite destruction effectively tarnished the reputation of the Doukhobors in BC, as many soon came to wrongly associate all Doukhobors with the Freedomites, even while the majority of the Doukhobors were especially afflicted by the heinous acts of the Freedomites, all the same. By 1924, the Doukhobor communities of Brilliant and Utashina near modern-day Castlegar, BC, were, under the leadership of Peter Verrigan, a thriving agro-industrial complex. Built on the confluence of the Columbia and Kootenay rivers, the Doukhobor community cultivated almost 2,000 acres of farms and orchards, and in the village of Brilliant, the Kootenay Columbia Jam Factory stood at the center of it all, surrounded as well by the towering Brilliant grain elevator, fruit packing shed, a general store, and the Brilliant train station. In 1913, the construction of the Brilliant suspension bridge over the Kootenay River permanently connected the Brilliant and Utashina Doukhobor settlements and stood as a proud reminder of Doukhobor's strength and unity, while the Doukhobors would continue to flourish for the next few years. In 1921, the Doukhobor community at Brilliant decided to express their appreciation for their beloved leader Peter Verrigan, and by 1922 completed the construction of a small, beautifully designed house in the rocky hills above Brilliant, where Verrigan would come to spend much of his time when he wasn't busy managing affairs in the village below. It was a prosperous time for the Doukhobors, a peaceful time, when after 200 years of hardship, perhaps the Doukhobors had finally achieved peace. But it would not last. It was the night of Sunday, April 20th, 1924, when the villagers of Brilliant awoke to the sight of Verrigan's hillside retreat engulfed in flames. The Doukhobors rushed to save the building, before discovering that the brilliant school and 2 other schools in Utoshina were similarly set ablaze. By the morning of the next day, Verrigan's home and the community schools were completely destroyed, and it was soon discovered that the previous night, a school in Grand Forks had similarly been set on fire. This was the first of many Freedomite attacks on the Doukhobor community, resulting in the destruction of countless Doukhobor properties and contributing to the overall decline of the Doukhobor community in BC. The foundations of Verrigan's hillside retreat can still be seen here, in the hills above Brilliant Bridge, which still stands to this day. Only a few months later, on October 29th, 1924, Peter Verrigan was killed in a train bombing near Farron, BC, a small station halfway between Grand Forks and Castlegar, when what is believed to have been a time bomb detonated directly beneath Verrigan's seat, killing most all of the passengers in the car. Many suspects in the case have been identified, ranging from the Canadian or Russian governments to the Ku Klux Klan of Oregon State. It is no small coincidence, however, that only months following the Freedomite-led destruction of Verrigan's community in Brilliant, that Verrigan was assassinated in a train bombing that October. Nearly 7,000 Doukhobors attended Peter Verrigan's funeral that November, and Verrigan was eventually entombed in the rocky hills above Brilliant, directly above the ruins of what was once his hillside home. In the years following, the Freedomites made several attempts to destroy the tomb, until in 1944 they successfully shattered the structure with explosives. But the tomb was soon replaced with what stands here to this day, at Verrigan Memorial Park, in the hills above Brilliant, BC. The death of Peter Verrigan was the beginning of the end for the once prosperous West Kootenay Doukhobors, and Freedomite terrorism would contribute to the overall decline and eventual bankruptcy of the Doukhobor community in 1938. While very few traditional Doukhobor buildings still exist in the valley of Castlegar today, Doukhobor history remains an important part of the culture in the West Kootenays, especially in the modern locality of Brilliant, just east of Castlegar, where some signs can still be read in both English and Russian, and the Brilliant USCC Hall still plays an important role in the community. Just south of Brilliant, on the west side of Highway 3, the Doukhobor Discovery Center remains an impressive display of Doukhobor heritage. The Doukhobor village here is not an original village at all, but the replica of a complete Doukhobor village first constructed in 1971, when local residents came to realize that there were very few, if not any, original Doukhobor villages left in the area following the decline of the Doukhobor community over the course of the century. The center houses a vast collection of Doukhobor artifacts, farm equipment, and this statue, erected in honor of Leo Tolstoy, the Doukhobors' great benefactor, who first helped them settle in this new world. North of Castlegar, near halfway to the city of Nelson, the village of Cristobal, like Gilpin, contains a large number of descendants of the Freedomite movement, where in the summer of 1953, 400 homes in the Cristobal area were burned as part of their anti-materialist protest against the Canadian government and the Canadian educational system. Throughout the 1950s, as part of a crackdown on Freedomite terrorism, the Canadian government would imprison most all of the most criminal Freedomites, and in a much more controversial manner, forcibly relocate a large number of Freedomite children to a residential school in New Denver, where they were later alleged to have been mistreated and abused. The government's treatment of these Doukhobor children remains a point of contention to this day, when on February 1st, 2024, the BC government issued a formal apology to the Sons of Freedom Doukhobors for their actions nearly 70 years ago. Regardless of any wrongs committed by the Canadian government, as terrible as they may be, it would seem that of all the traditional Doukhobor beliefs the Sons of Freedom so avidly believed in, the rejection of religious icons, material simplicity, and communal ownership, it would seem that their extremism resulted in them all but forgetting one of the Doukhobors' most crucial tenets: pacifism. While the majority of the Doukhobors never lost focus of their pacifist beliefs, even in the face of adversity and disagreement with the Canadian government, the Freedomites seem to have forgotten this most important Doukhobor value, of which would result in their eventual downfall and the overall decline of the Doukhobor community in BC. While the Doukhobor community might not be as strong as it once was in the valleys of eastern British Columbia, Doukhobor culture will live on in this area of the world, a land of opportunity for those brave enough to seek it out.